All right, so last time we spoke, I went over the death of Alexander the Great, and I could have ended it there, but I thought I should make a part three just because there were a few things I wanted to talk about. Although this is an extensive subject, and there's a ton of stuff I could bring up that belittles his character. But there's three key issues I would like to talk about. One of the first ones being his second in command during the entire process of his empire building, and that was his general Parmenion. Parmenion is a very interesting character who kind of got shadowed during all of these events, and he was a significant person in power. He is honestly, he could be argued to be responsible for many of the victories Alexander had. And to start off, we'll talk about why he's important. So Parmenion, he was born some point around 400 BC, and he died in 330 BC. He served as the Macedonian general under both Philip II and Alexander, so the father and the son. So, when Alexander the Great had taken the throne, he had many enemies. One of these enemies was a man by the name Attalus. Attalus was the uncle of Cleopatra Eritis, who I had mentioned previously, who got killed by Alexander's mom, her kids as well. So Attalus also had insulted Alexander, I believe, at the wedding banquet, in which he kind of said something about him not being a legitimate king, the question of full Macedonian blood and such. So Alexander hated this guy. He wanted to kill him. So when Alexander took the throne, one of the first people to go was going to be Attalus. Attalus had been sent with Parmenion under Philip II to be pretty much sent as an expeditionary force to up Greek rebellion in Asia Minor. This was done with about 10,000 soldiers. As I had previously mentioned, this was Philip II's his plans to invade because he wanted to do this. So when Parmenion found out that Attalus was basically going to have his head chopped off, Parmenion did it himself. Even though they were friends, Parmenion realized it was inevitable that this man was going to be killed, and it ended up getting Parmenion basically a favor. Alexander was in debt to Parmenion, so he became the second in command as a result of this. Now, I can't talk about everything, but I'd like to give just a small historical background for Parmenion before Alexander took charge. So Parmenion, under King Philip II, was responsible for many great victories. One of the first ones being a victory over the Illyrians in 356 BC, in which he killed the king Grabos. Also, he took himself the Sicilian town of Halos, which is a strong strategic point for military victory, and he was one of the few delegates from Macedonia to be appointed to conclude a peace treaty with the Athenians in 346 BC, and he was remarked by King Philip II to be the only trustworthy general. Alright, so like I had mentioned, when Alexander took the throne, at this time Parmenion and Attalus had been sent already over into the west point of Asia Minor with 10,000 forces in order to create a rebellion. So to rile up all the Greek people to go against the Persians in order to hurt the forces of the Persians in order for Philip II to come over with his forces because he planned an invasion. Parmenion was the mind behind this whole thing, and he had a lot of success, and he had risen a lot of troops. Fortunately, when the news came that Philip II had been assassinated, there was a great demoralization in his forces, and he was seeing some losses. I wouldn't discredit him. I think it really came down to the moral problem. He was doing quite well beforehand. So, in 334 BC, when Alexander came over, they merged their forces and began to ensue into battles. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there's a few key ones that I think are quite important in establishing why Parmenion is an important figure and why Alexander should be belittled in this regard. So we have the Battle of Granicus, which I said properly this time, I believe. So this is an important one for both Alexander and Parmenion. At the start of the battle, they noticed the forces of the Persians on the other side of a riverbank. This defensive position gave the Persians quite an advantage, and Alexander wanted to just charge head-on and attack them. Parmenion advised that this was a very stupid idea, and that they should go further upstream, cross the riverbank during night, and attack in the daylight, in which they would have more of an equal footing against the chariots. This is where ancient scholars contradict another. Most of them say that upon hearing this, Alexander told Parmenion to take the left flank, to hold the phalanx, and to take most of the brunt of the Persians' damage towards them. So he was at odds, I think like a 1-to-3 ratio, and he had to hold off while Alexander just head-on rushed with the cavalry and attacked to win the battle. Some more modern ancient scholars have brought up the issue that it's possible Alexander did listen to Parmenion and did wait. But for the most part, I will go with what most scholars have said, in which Alexander had gone head on right away. They did win the battle. And this is mostly due, I have to say, to Parmenion living, because the odds against him when he had his troops holding off the main brunt of the Persians is extraordinary. And the course of most battles end up like this, where Parmenion has this left flank with a phalanx or other troops, and Alexander always ends up in a right flank maneuver where he's trying to just attack at the right moment to win the day. It goes without saying that Parmenion is more of the general-minded person, where Alexander is governed more by his emotions, and it does win out because Alexander never lost a battle, but it goes without saying that Parmenion probably is the better general in this regard. So after the Battle of Granicus, Parmenion ends up going on his own with some forces to do other things, while Alexander does what he does. Did you think that Alexander was always involved in all the battles? Because this is absolutely not true. So some of the things Parmenion did. He took the stronghold of Dasilium, capital of Pergae. I think I said that right. Without much effort. They went down not with a big fight. He also seized Magnesia, Trallius, and Lydia. Alexander, by 334 BC, liberated Sardes, Ephes, Miletus, and Halicarnassus in Anatolia. Anatolia is basically this region right here. It's a kind of Asia Minor, but for lack of better words, I should call it Anatolia at this point. During this, Parmenion goes and he invades central Anatolia, driving west to the remaining Persian forces that are kind of being scattered and moved by endless losses in battles. And he meets up with Alexander in 333 BC at the Battle of Gordium, where they have another major victory. Aside from this, we have the Battle of Issus. I didn't say Isis this time. I think it's Issus. I hope so. Right over here. It's another legendary battle where they first confronted Darius. This battle goes almost the same as Granicus. I think ancient scholars say that it's because Darius was trying to set up the same battle mentality where he had his chariots in charge, but yet again, they do the same thing. Parmenion takes a left flank, he takes the brunt of the Persian forces, and Alexander waits for his right flank and his cavalry to attack. Same thing goes down. He forced Darius to flee. Yet again, Parmenion, against all odds, because this time Darius had significant forces against him, his flank survived. So after this, Parmenion does one of the greatest things he ever does during the whole campaign. He rushes over to Damascus, which is like 350 kms from that position, and he seizes the treasury of Darius without them having a single chance to protect it. He literally surprises the garrison there, and he claims all the booty in the name of the Macedonian Empire. He acquires about 55 tons of gold, silver, 329 female musicians, 306 cooks, 13 pastry chefs, 70 wine waiters, and all the women of Darius's court. He needed over 7,000 pack animals to bring all the booty back to Alexander. That's what ancient scholars are telling us. It's probably exaggerated, but it's neat to say. This is probably one of his greatest achievements, because he just literally took this treasury by storm. Now, he comes back and he's with Alexander, and we have the Battle of Gaugamela, another significant battle to talk about, in which they face Darius again. Same thing is playing out. We have Parmenion on the left flank beside the phalanx, Alexander is with the cavalry on the right flank. Yet again, repeating the same battle mentality, Parmenion is holding off a major Persian onslaught. The brunt of the Persians are attacking his position. However, this time, his forces are starting to crumble because Darius had significant forces at this point. Alexander is faced with a choice. He can head-on rush with his cavalry, attack, and possibly kill Darius. Bit of a risk, or he can come to Parmenion's aid because he can see, and Parmenion's sending messengers like, please help me, my troops are falling apart. Alexander surprisingly chooses to help him. He runs over, there's a whole confusion amongst Persian ranks, everything's going everywhere. Darius, yet again, he decides to flee and escape. So after Gaugamela, Darius is later killed, unfortunately, by one of his own men, and Parmenion is sent off to go conquer more lands, because Parmenion and Alexander, they separate many different times to be more effective. It's not like Alexander is taking over all of this by himself in some great triumph. He has Parmenion to take over a lot of territories by himself. This is where the downfall comes for Parmenion, and this is something I think that belittles Alexander as a ruler and his character slightly. So Alexander is quite a paranoid person, and he has a lot of people executed, and there's a lot of informants telling him that there's people conspiring to kill him. Absolutely can be true because of the tensions that Alexander produced with wearing Persian clothes, bringing people from India and Persia into his ranks, and he's very much aggravating the Macedonians. Anyways, Parmenion has a son in the ranks called Philotas, who I have mentioned previously. He's a significant character. Philotas is one of these people who allegedly was conspiring to kill Alexander. Alexander learns of this, and he has him executed. At this point, Alexander realizes he has sent Parmenion away, and Parmenion's doing something, but news will come to Parmenion about his son's death. Alexander is pitted in a bad situation. He basically decides that he can't leave Parmenion to be alive. Parmenion will probably take his life, and he is justified to do so. So Alexander sends Cleander and Sitocles, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, to go and assassinate the man. A man who fought for Alexander's father, was the most trustworthy general, his father's own words, and who fought bravely and hard for Macedonia and for Alexander. A great general, and a large reason for much of the success of Alexander the Great. Because Alexander the Great, when he took the throne, he was a good leader, and he was a good military thinker. But having such a large-scale veteran at his side only aided him, and thus was the downfall of Parmenion. So to conclude this chapter in Alexander the Great, I just want to raise the issue of the large empire that he took. It's a little exaggerated, and it's a little difficult to perceive that this entire red region that's shown on the map isn't exactly all taken under his control. So to start off, ancient scholar Plutarch tells us that Alexander conquered and took and founded no less than 70 cities. This is a very exaggerated number, and scholars today would estimate that it was in the range of the low 20s that he had renamed and taken. You can see all of these cities over here that are named Alexandria, something else. He was very full of himself. I think there's about 12 of them. But to make a point, he starts off here, and he's in a line, and he's taking major cities. Now, as you can see on the map, that it kind of curves around and goes in the middle of this great empire, in this great espace region. Most of the people in the other regions over here have no idea that he's even there or there's a new ruler of what's going on. He only has significant influence in the cities he's taken, if any. This empire is basically, it's almost as if it's a contract that's just been given to him, where people are not completely aware that he's even there. And like the Armenia, for example, they probably had no idea this was even happening. It visually looks great on a map, but most of this wasn't influenced by Greek culture until after his death. And there comes the next point, in which how did all of this crumble and become the Hellenistic period? So, alongside taking all of these great cities, how did he administer them? He pretty much didn't. He neglected all of them. What he did was, of those that weren't going to openly rebel against him, who would be executed immediately, he would leave the previous satraps, kings, or noblemen that were in charge simply in charge to do as they saw fit, as long as they paid him tribute. This led him also to give vast amounts of regions to his veteran troops in military garrison settlements around. On top of that, he forced a lot of these men, as I had said previously, to marry Persian women and to meld the cultures together, which is a complete catastrophe, and it failed horribly. So upon his death, all these men that were forced to marry basically killed their wives, divorced them, got rid of them, and scattered and left these regions. So he didn't have any strong political force in place to keep a full empire to be maintained. It became what is known the Hellenistic period, in which multiple kingdoms arrived from his previous companions, who each took a chunk. Just to give you an example, Ptolemy ended up taking Egypt. The Seleucid Empire was over here. Another man took what is the mainland Greece. One man took what is like Anatolia. and they all became warring states because Alexander had never really placed much administration. It was a catastrophic failure. And this would lead further to the Roman conquest of the Greek people as a result. Because maybe one could argue Alexander didn't have enough time, he had died very early. But for lack of better words, he didn't do much administration, and that was a huge issue. Now, I could talk about more things, because there's a lot more to be thrown on this shit-talking adventure about Alexander the Great. For instance, the technology of the Macedonians was incredible, and the Persians had never seen some of the things that were brought over, as well as the equipment. The Persians were not outfitted very well compared to the Macedonians, who had excellent equipment, and this significantly helped, and it shows in the numbers. The Macedonians were almost always confronted with armies 3 times their size, and they still won. The phalanx and the equipment go without saying. They gave a huge advantage to Alexander's forces. Now, just to compile all this for the end, I didn't mean for this to be an entire shit talk on Alexander, but it ended up being so. We talked about how his empire wasn't as big as it looks like on paper. He didn't administer very well. He probably killed his father, and his mom was involved in killing other members in order for him to get to the throne. Alexander was a drunk, and I don't think any scholars would argue that. He clearly got drunk and did horrible things. I had failed to even mention he burnt down a Persian palace in a fit of drunken humor, in which he just let his men go ahead and do this, and he regretted it immediately afterwards. So he wasn't really governed by a strong head at times, and it shows in his performance on the battlefield, in which Parmenion, many times, was trying to outline plans to win a victory like a general should, and Alexander kind of just is shown by ancient scholars to bull rush head on with his cavalry. Top of this, Alexander, when he didn't get things his way or there was a mutiny, he kind of would cry in a tent and stop eating. It's really unusual behavior for a leader, but saying all of this, I don't want to go ahead and say, oh, he should be remembered as a terrible person and he doesn't deserve recognition. He deserves recognition. The feat that he did is amazing. He brought Greek culture to a vast amount of territory, and there's a reason why so many people read into him and were fascinated by him. Like, let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar, 2 very big people that loved him and loved reading stories about him. This concludes the 3-part series I made about him, and I will stop shitting talking this poor man. I would like to hear from all of you now. Any comments you have about how I performed during all of this, maybe critiquing it. I know I butchered names and my editing isn't the best, and I'm using a TV screen to show a map especially. I would love to hear from you. If you haven't seen my intro video about me, I specialize also in the Republic of Rome as a history, as well as a little bit on the Empire, although I don't have so much background in that, and I strongly know about ancient Greece. Are you interested perhaps maybe in hearing about things in World War II? I have extensive knowledge about the Pacific Theater on the side of the Japanese and the Americans, of course. And I have some interesting ideas about portraying some historic evidence about what the Americans did to the Japanese in particular, because I don't think a lot of people know about the atrocities performed on their people by the Americans, except for, of course, the atom bomb. Perhaps you want to hear about cliche things like the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the 300 fought. I could go on a lot about the battle and the details of how unbelievably exaggerated this is. Please send emails or comments below and tell me what you think. Can't wait to hear from you.